Hello and welcome to Comic Island. In celebration of Valentine's Day, this is my top 10 list of superhero romances. Now the rules on this one are pretty simple. I'm sticking to any relationship between superheroes within the comic universes of Marvel and DC, though both parties do not have to be superheroes themselves. I'm keeping it to couples within these universes because a lot of other independent comics deal specifically with romance as a genre, and it's not really fair to compare those relationships with the ones developed within superhero stories, where romance is generally not the central focus. Also, remember that this list is just my opinion. I haven't read every comic out there, nor am I really an expert on romances and fiction. These are just ones that stick in my memory and I think are the best developed relationships between superhero characters. So without delay, let's begin the top 10 superhero romances. But first, honorable mentions: Spider-Man and Gwen Stacy, Luke Cage and Jessica Jones, Angel and Psylocke, and many, many others. So this wound up being a rather competitive list. So much so that what's in the top 10 isn't really objectively the best romances in comics, but rather a subjective list including 10 of my favorites. Many good romances that I really like and are big romances were bound to be excluded from this list. And at the end of the day, it felt important to acknowledge some of the solid romances that for various reasons just didn't quite make it. There's simply too many to go into detail as to why they all couldn't come, but one of the most notable absences might be the lack of Gwen Stacy. I chose to omit this relationship because I feel like this story only really works because of her death. Before Gwen's death, she was just another classic girlfriend to the hero without much depth to her or her relationship with Peter. But her death, though unplanned, created something much more meaningful for the relationship retroactively and ultimately symbolic for who Spider-Man is as a character and a hero. So it is an important relationship worth mentioning, but not one that I felt belonged on this top 10. The other romances that didn't make this list are usually good romances in the hands of the right writers, but are too often bogged down by melodramatic nonsense or other problems and just didn't quite make the cut. That being said, many of these relationships are interesting when handled by a competent writer and deserve some recognition. At the end of the day, I can only have 10 couples on this list and I had to make some tough choices. So with that, number 10. Jean Grey and Wolverine. Perhaps the romance I feel most conflicted over putting on this list. Jean Grey and the love triangle between Wolverine and Cyclops managed to take the number 10 spot. This feels like a classic example of a love triangle, but thanks to the unique personalities of these three characters, feels distinct enough from the usual story that comes out of a setup like this. Even at their worst, which is probably in the movies or in some of the lesser X-Men comics, the relationship between these three generally works for me. In Wolverine's latest movie, the parts with him being haunted by Jean Grey were honestly some of the most compelling moments of that film, and I can't help but like this set of relationships. For the record, it is specifically Jean Grey and Wolverine's complex relationship that takes this spot, though this relationship is made much stronger by the presence of Cyclops. For whatever reason, I like this relationship in particular over Jean and Scott's complex history, and in my opinion, overly idealized relationship. Something about these two just seems so real to me. Jean knows that Logan probably wouldn't be very good for her, but she can't help but feel something towards him. And there's something really interesting and importantly very real about a relationship like this, where the girl knows somebody is bad for her but can't help but feel a little attracted to them. I know people who have been in situations like that. Heck, I've been in a situation like that, so this feels like a problem I can relate to. The only downside to this relationship, and the reason that it's so low on this list, is that this relationship and love triangle is too often overly dramatic, and these days Jean Grey has been built up in the X-Men community as the greatest person of all time. Though I don't feel it is the greatest story ever, it does deserve to be on this list, as I feel this relationship is not only quite compelling, but more pivotal than any other couple within the X-Men at actually shaping the actual story of the team itself, and the dynamics of the characters within them. That distinction is rare, although not heard of in a team-based comic book, and for this reason, I chose to make this number 10 on my list.
The only reason Jean and you stayed together at all is she was too strong to give in to what she really wanted, and you were too scared.
Hey Logan, that healing power's about to come in really handy.
Number 9. Superman and Lois Lane. Another classic relationship, this one is pretty self-explanatory. One of the most recognizable and iconic figures in the comic book world, it's hard not to include Superman and Lois on this list. Perhaps what is more surprising is that I put it so low at number 9. After all, this is a classic relationship, so of course it should be one of the best. And there's a lot that works for this couple. Lois's attitude and behaviors vary depending on the era, writer, and media, but what's always common in these stories is her fearlessness and willing to cover dangerous stories as a journalist. These traits work well for somebody in a relationship with Superman, as not only does it give an easy reason for her to be at the front lines of various conflicts and cataclysms, but it also gives her a personality that makes her a plausible match for Superman. Brave and bold, but also hiding a sense of wonder, she works well with both the Clark and Superman persona to make for a classic comic book relationship. So why are they so low on the list? Well, I think in some ways these two are victims of their own success. The only reason these two don't take a spot at number 2 or 3 is because between the movies, video games, television shows, and comics over the 7 decades Superman has been around, there's a lot of stuff with Lois Lane, and not all of it has been very good. And it's hard to talk about these two without qualifying this with the fact that for all the good moments between Lois Lane and Superman, there are a lot of bad ones too. I choose to accept the good with the bad. For all the Superman returns in the world, there's an all-star Superman or secret identity. This romance has become an iconic part of what people think of when they think of Superman, and in my view is one of the very best couples out there. Number 8. Emma Frost and Cyclops. Now this one I'm pretty sure I will get flack for, but I actually do like the tumultuous relationship between Scott and Emma over Scott and Jean. For one thing, this relationship is way more entertaining, but I think there's more to it when it comes to this couple. This is a relationship that's been through a lot. Starting out as a psychic affair behind Jean Grey's back, Scott would find comfort in her after Jean's tragic death. Although their personalities seem at odds with one another, they forged a deep bond together, and as Scott took on the leadership role of the X-Men, Emma became increasingly a close confidant and advisor for him. Though this wouldn't stop the two from going behind each other's back if they felt the situation called for it. Their relationship was badly damaged during the events of Avengers vs. X-Men, and currently the two are no longer together. I like this couple quite a bit. Emma Frost is a fun character in the right hands, and she plays well off of Scott's more serious attitude. She was a cool companion for the conflicted leader, and I think this is a big part of why this relationship works for me. It's comics like Astonishing X-Men that showcases why these two can work together so well. They trust one another and know what to expect from each other. And the entire time they were together, it was an interesting transition period for Scott, who was becoming an increasingly ruthless leader, while Emma mostly just sat around and made sarcastic comments on the whole situation. The dynamic, for whatever reason, consistently works for me, and I find these two fascinating when they're together. Another thing I like is that this couple feels like it evolves and changes with these two characters. So even now, when they aren't together, I still enjoy seeing them work together and am interested in what happens next. I also enjoy how all the other X-Men react to this relationship. At first disgusted with Scott for being with someone so close to his own wife's death, or outraged that he would be in a relationship with a former villain, who's actually tortured some of the X-Men. Many of the X-Men and others would express concern and mistrust in Emma Frost and her potential influence on Scott. It made for a really interesting dynamic between these two and the rest of the teammates. Collectively, there's a lot this couple offers, and they are one of my favorites.
What's this all about?
What do you think? Superpowers, a scintillating wit, and the best body money can buy. And I still rate below a corpse.
Number 7. Xavin and Karolina. Without a doubt the two most obscure characters on this list, Xavin and Karolina easily make my list as a favorite relationship from the awesome and often overlooked series known as The Runaways. For those unfamiliar with the story, I'll catch you up. The Runaways are a group of children who have villains as parents. Most of them are children of a criminal group called the Pride, a powerful faction that used to have a tight grip on the criminal activities of Los Angeles. The Runaways have disavowed their parents and, not trusting a world of adults, tend to keep themselves and using their inherited powers and abilities to survive. Each character is associated with a different faction of the superpowered community. For example, one member called Nico uses magic, while another, Molly Hayes, is a mutant. Xavin and Karolina are both aliens. Xavin is a Skrull, while Karolina is a part of a race called the Majestanians. As part of a political settlement between these two warring races, Xavin was promised Karolina's hand in marriage. Though initially forced together under these unusual circumstances, these two have actually wound up becoming one of my favorite all-time superhero relationships. It's a fascinating story of devotion and sacrifice. Initially, Karolina was very reluctant to be with Xavin, as Karolina is a lesbian and Xavin introduces himself as a man. But as a shape-shifting alien, Karolina's sexuality has never really given Xavin pause, and she immediately adopts a female form and persona to better suit her partner. This unique romance is really cool depiction and exploration of gender roles, and it's quite amazing to see Xavin gradually become increasingly identified with a female gender. It shows compromise and self-confidence, willing to change yourself for someone you care about, and as a result, this relationship really works for me. To top things off, Xavin is eventually forced to be imprisoned in Karolina's place by the Majestanians. This willingness to sacrifice and the tragic end to their romance is both memorable and quite moving. I wish that more of this relationship was explored. While some of the romances in this video suffer from overuse and bad adaptations, this one is so obscure it is underdeveloped and often missed by comic book fans. Number 6. Beast and Agent Brand. With a romance first kindled under a snowbank on the treacherous and hostile alien planet called Breakworld, my number 6 all-time favorite comic book romance is between the X-Man Beast and Head of S.W.O.R.D. Agent Abigail Brand. S.W.O.R.D. is the official group tasked with defending Earth from alien threats. Think of it as the shield of space, and Agent Abigail Brand as the equivalent of Nick Fury for it. And what can I say, these two are fun. You don't often see them together as they are both busy with their respective jobs, which places an understandable burden on their personal time. But every time these two are together, often just glimpses or hints within the comics, I always wind up laughing at this couple. The banter between these two is great, and you can tell it is always grounded in mutual respect for one another. They like each other for their eccentricities, so it works as a relationship, and the alien nature of Agent Brand, who is half human and half something else, really works and makes for somebody who would plausibly want to be with somebody like, well, modern-day Beast. It's a fun relationship that I can see play out over and over without ever getting tired of it, and one that I hope never really goes away.
I guess I'll start. I'm fairly certain I hate you.
Well, that's kind of the point.
Number 5. Terra and Beast Boy. What can I say? Tragedy and romance often work well together, and it seems to blend like cookies and milk. It doesn't surprise me that many of the romances on this list have tragic ends, because that's what a good romance story often entails. And I understand that sort of thing has been going on for some time. Terra and Beast Boy are a tragic story, and one that I might get flack for including, as they never really had a full-out romance. But I've always felt the connection between these two was very real. This is depicted in her initial appearance in the Teen Titan comics, but the cartoon also did a really good job with her. And I even more or less liked her brief return in Blackest Night. These stories serve to illustrate a traitorous character in the form of the seemingly innocent Terra. She joins the Teen Titans under the auspices of wanting to be a hero, but is revealed to have been working for Deathstroke as a spy, before she dies due to reckless use of her own powers. But I feel like we get a good sense, particularly in the cartoon, that she's actually interested in some form of redemption. And it feels like she was just so close were it not for some circumstances and Terra's existing personal issues. I admit this is much murkier in the comics, especially because it includes a romance with Deathstroke, which is quite possibly one of the grossest comic book romances out there. I do give the cartoon series props for doing a better job at walking the line between a villainous and heroic version of Terra. It solidified the potential bond between the two, and made it all the more tragic when Terra eventually returned, only to be a normal girl with no memory of her time as a superhero. It's impressive that a cartoon was able to pull off something so memorable, and do it in a way that I actually prefer over the comic. And that's why this sad story of betrayal and loss winds up being my 5th favorite all-time superhero romance.
Beast Boy, I'm not going back. I can't.
What? Why can't you?
Because she's not your friend. She's my apprentice.
Number 4. Mary Jane and Spider-Man. so I don't particularly feel the need to explain this one too much. It's unrealistic to think that anybody doesn't know who these people are, and why this relationship is significant. But just because something is iconic doesn't automatically grant it a spot on this list. I chose to add this couple because I do really think they work in just about every depiction I've... Oh, fuck you! Okay, for the most part these two work together. With a few notable exceptions here and there. And let's get the other elephant in the room out of the way. This relationship has been destroyed by the infamous One More Day event, a comic which I'm getting so tired of talking about in my videos, but did such irreparable damage to the Spider-Man continuity that it's hard to talk about the hero without mentioning it. But I remember seeing Mary Jane transform from a one-dimensional girl-next-door character / supermodel to Spider-Man's greatest ally, confidant, and best friend. I remember a time when these two worked through their problems together, when they were a happy team, totally in love and devoted to one another. It worked, and I was sad to see their marriage go in the mainstream comics. But most iterations of these two wind up having excellent relationships, as I've seen in stuff like the Ultimate Comics and MC2. The obvious exception is the movies, which most people agree suffers from bad chemistry, casting, and dialogue. But it's something I'm willing to overlook because of just how well these two work together in the comics, and how great this relationship has been throughout Spider-Man history. It's a classic romance for the ages, but also a nuanced one of sacrifice, compromise, and understanding. These two are one of my favorites, and I'm sure one day we'll see them together again. Number 3. Batman and Wonder Woman. So if you thought I was bad for including a couple based mostly off one cartoon with Beast Boy and Terra, well get ready, because my third choice is a relationship that almost exclusively exists from the Justice League cartoon of the early 2000s. But like the creators of that show, I also feel that Superman and Wonder Woman don't really work as a couple, and that Batman makes a much more compatible choice for Wonder Woman. What does a Boy Scout like Superman share in common with a warrior goddess like Wonder Woman aside from sheer physical power? What would they talk about on a date? The news? Patriarchy? I admit I can't see Batman and Wonder Woman really going out to a movie together, but I could see them training together, or going out, finding a bunch of crooks, and then returning home for a bout of sweet, sweet lovemaking. But seriously, I think these two work together for that reason. These are two passionate and driven people who take their work and their duty above all else. I think that makes these two ideal partners for one another, and I think it's the best relationship I've seen with either of these two characters. Especially considering the continued insistence of writers to try having a relationship that makes no sense, like between Batman or Talia or Catwoman, which seems fatally flawed to me, and the whole Catwoman thing is getting really old and stale at this point. So I'd like to see more of these two together. I think there's more to it than what we've seen in the cartoon, and would be worth exploring in the comics, and it'd be something a little different and fresh from the usual romances we see spin out of the big trinity of DC heroes.
3. If my enemies knew I had someone special, they wouldn't rest until they'd gotten to me through her.
Next.
Number 2. Daredevil and Elektra. Next on this list is another one that I'm guessing most are familiar with. Daredevil and Elektra is another tragic tale, and in my opinion it really is one of the best. Elektra lost her father as a young student at Columbia University at a time when she was dating classmate Matt Murdock. She dropped out of school and began studying martial arts with the hand. Eventually she broke away from the clan and began working as a freelance assassin. She eventually encountered Daredevil and defeated him. He reveals his secret identity to her, and she would work together with him, though they would often come into conflict. During one battle, Elektra was killed by Bullseye in a bid to become Kingpin's assassin. Though she would eventually be resurrected, things would never quite feel the same, as the hand seems to have left her spiritually corrupted. Things have generally become tense between these former lovers. Like I said, sometimes a good tragedy makes for an equally good romance. There is real potential for these two to have a good relationship as two badasses trained in martial arts, but thanks to circumstances, Elektra has largely been corrupted and given over to the proverbial dark side, using more lethal methods that Daredevil can't possibly approve of. It's a rare situation where a resurrection actually strengthens the sense of loss in regards to this romance, and it feels like things are way too far gone at this point. And I think that's what works about it. Elektra's death and corruption at the loss of her father has irreversibly killed any chance for redemption for this assassin, and for any love between her and Matt. For the ongoing tragedy that is Matt Murdock's life, this becomes of tremendous value in understanding both Daredevil and Elektra as characters. Of course, I should talk about the one time the story really didn't work, which was the poorly handled Daredevil movie. But it's getting pretty easy to ignore this thing these days, especially with the upcoming Daredevil Netflix series that I'm sure will be much better. I can look past the movie and see something that really worked in the comics, which is why I think these two represent some of the best storytelling with romance and superheroes. Number 1. Invisible Woman and Mr. Fantastic. Ah yes, the number 1 spot. I actually struggled with these two for a long time. For a while, they weren't on my top 10 at all, and you can hardly blame me. The Fantastic Four have never been that popular, and in my opinion are one of the most unappreciated gems in Marvel's vast collection of various characters. There's also those movies, which I really feel suffered from poor casting and, the fact that they were awful movies. And it does feel a little unfair to include these two, who unlike most superheroes, were always constructed and developed with the idea of these two being together. Even Superman was created before Lois Lane after all. But for as long as there's been a Reed Richards, there's been a Sue Storm for him to romantically entangle with. In spite of this, I do feel that these two best represent a good romance in a comic book. Of course, characters this old are going to have plenty of moments where these two have just been awful to each other, especially Reed Richards, and it's awfully hard to overlook those movies. But on the whole, these two are more often than not depicted as kind and loving to each other and the children they've had together. No matter how crazy the situation gets, these two always end up sticking together, working things out, and caring for one another above all else. Yes, there are hiccups, and they make mistakes like everyone else, but in the hands of a good writer, these two really shine. The best example is how Alan Hickman has been depicting these two lately on the ongoing Time Runs Out event. They are unflinchingly willing to work across sides and act like a real team. They know each other's strengths and weaknesses, and this represents a true partnership between heroes. And I think this romance is treated differently than most other superheroes who get in relationships. Most focus on the early stages of the relationship, with a cliched will they won't they approach, or depicting a couple who has just started dating. But with these two, the focus is on a successful marriage with children. So I think the writers have to work a little harder at showing these two together without falling for the trap of creating a Jim and Pam situation. These two work their way up to the very top of my list of best romances for this reason. I'm not saying they're the world's greatest couple, or even the most compatible couple in comics. But these two are, in my opinion, the best example of a superhero relationship done right, and one that's done in a way that isn't melodramatic or lazy. So that's it for my list of top 10 superhero romances. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what your favorite comic book romances are in the comments section below. You can support the comics industry by buying comics through our Amazon links. We also have a website and Facebook page where you can keep up on the latest and greatest in the world of comics. And finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.